Hi everyone. Oh my gosh, he's loud. Okay. We are really happy that so many of you care about policy briefs. It's a good sign for AEFP. We are going to start. We are to be, I don't know if you can see these mics, but they're recording this live, so all your questions that you have for us will be live, recorded, and broadcast forever. So I'm going to start introducing people, and then we'll just start at the end and work on down. We have some great panelists today. I'm really excited about this. We first have DAPHNE KENYON at the Lincoln Institute, VENESSA KEESLER at Michigan Department of Education, Matt CHINGOS from the Urban Institute, Jason GRISSOM from Vanderbilt University, and you all know this person, CONAWAY, who's at who's at Massachusetts Department of Education. We're gonna pick either one. So this is, and I'm Katharine STRUNK, I'm at MSU, and I am the policy brief editor for EFP. So we put this panel together, we started thinking about it, Carrie and I, because we really want more people to be submitting policy briefs to EFP, and also to be writing policy briefs that take the great research that people are doing who come to this conference and actually make it easy for policymakers to access and work with and act upon. So we thought, well, we should probably talk about how to do that. So we asked these great people because they either write great policy briefs and they provide great examples and they know a lot about it, or they're people who consume the policy briefs. So clearly we have VENESSA and CARRIE who are on the policymaker side, and the other three people who write wonderful policy briefs. I'm going to ask some questions first to kick us off, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. I will ask you guys when you ask your questions to come up to the microphone because we need to be able to hear them on the recording. Okay, we'll start. So we're going to start with Matt because he had the great idea for this question. So Matt, what is a policy brief?
So I think of maybe a policy brief is not, maybe we should change the term at the start of the panel here so we can't do anything, right? Maybe it's more helpful to think about policy writing than a policy brief. It implies it's one thing. But I think of policy writing as writing that's for a non-technical audience, and often for an audience without a whole lot of time. But I think there's a lot of different kinds. Obviously, the policy briefs that get published in EFP are one kind of policy brief. But more generally, I think they can take the form of, for example, a review of research on a topic and with emphasis on what it means for a certain sort of policymaker. Right, so review of research on federal student aid and what it means for federal policymakers. A review of research on class size and what it means for state policymakers, and so on. A policy brief could also be a summary of a paper you've written, but with a focus on sort of the findings and what they mean for policymakers without all sort of the technical detail, but providing enough information to the audience to buy sort of what you've done. I think a policy brief could be an analysis of a policy proposal that's come out there with some, maybe some new evidence on what it might mean for different groups of students or other actors. So I think it can accomplish sort of a lot of different things, which makes it all interesting for us to talk about.
Anyone have anything to add? Yeah, Daphne.
So the Lincoln Institute takes the brief part of policy brief very seriously. Our Director of Publications and Communications has decreed that they can be no more than 4 pages. So I like Matt's statement that there are a variety of policy briefs, because when I looked at the policy briefs of different people on this panel, I saw that there was a wide range. But for ours, they're exactly 4 pages, and they are typically derived from a policy focus report that's more lengthy. So any of our authors that do a policy focus report are asked to do a policy brief as well. The first page has an introduction and a visual. The last page has recommendations. In between, it's somewhat different. I left some examples at the back of the room, but I think one of the things that this panel does in an interesting way is talks about the wide variety of what you can do with a policy brief. And Matt, when I looked at yours, it was 24 pages.
Which one?
The one on inequality of spending. And you didn't really label it a policy brief, but it said brief. And so at the Lincoln Institute, it wouldn't happen.
I'm sure I have to apply for a job.
Anyone else have anything to add? So kind of following from Daphne, from your comments, what are the key components of a good policy brief? We can start with Carrie. Do you want to start?
Oh, sure. I think it depends a little bit on which version of Matt's types of brief you're doing, but couple common things I've seen and ones I think are particularly effective. One is to have findings. I know that seems shocking, but not questions, not just questions, right? So I don't actually think of myself as a policymaker, but I think of myself as like a conduit or medium for policymakers, and they want to be able to quickly look through and see what the main points are in the bold type or the font, something that sort of makes it stand out. With detail below that is fine, but the findings that include numbers. And so it is amazing to me the number of academic papers where if you look at the abstract, it will give you directionality, but not the magnitude. And it is really helpful to have magnitudes. It can be a range. It doesn't have to be a precise estimate if that's not appropriate. It could be something that's coming out of like a predictive value out of a regression. So it doesn't have to be a raw descriptive data point with no sophisticated statistics underneath of it. But numbers really stick in people's minds in a way that just generalities or direction is not as helpful. I love it when briefs break out the data into smaller units. So if it's like a national thing, maybe it has state level findings, or if it's in my state, there's a report for districts, something to make it more specific to your location, because what's true nationally or what's true in your state might not be true in that district. And it's really helpful for people to be able to compare themselves against districts or other districts like themselves, those sorts of things. And I agree with Daphne that there should be recommendations, or at least conclusions, that aren't just we need to do more research.
Can I add one thing to that? I think the other thing that, one of the other elements of really good briefs is a visual, and Daphne mentioned this already, but we live in an age of social media where you really need the thing that you can blast out in part, so that's partly it. But also I just think people retain the picture much better than they even retain the number. You need the number, first of all, but then to be able to show a relationship or show how something's changing over time, even if it's a simple descriptive, that often sticks with people a lot more than the words.
Our communications person who ghostwrites some of our policy briefs says she thinks the policy brief should be something that you could hand to your uncle over Thanksgiving. I wonder if my fellow panelists agree with that.
Which uncle?
But I think by that she was emphasizing no jargon, right? Everything needs to be in plain English.
Good. So what shouldn't be in a policy brief then? Vanessa,
So kind of building on what Daphne said, I think there's three things that really shouldn't be in a policy brief, and the first one is too many words and too many technical words. And so I tend to fall more on the side as a policymaker of briefs are short. The brief part is real. The 20-page summary or longer thing, that's a different tool for a different audience. But if you're gonna give it to an actual policymaker, when we do one-pagers at the department, they are one page. So if you can get it to one page, the more pages, the less likely anybody's gonna sit and look at it. So one thing that shouldn't be there is too many words, and definitely not jargony words. If a person who's not in the discipline can't understand it, they're turned off, they'll put it down, they won't get to the point. Second thing that really shouldn't be in one, in my opinion, is the technical details of how you got there. So we, policymakers, don't really want to hear about the coolness of your diff and diff analysis or the, your regression coefficients or whatever you got going. They don't. They don't even really know what those things mean. Some do, most don't, and it's off-putting to people. So skip the technical details, put that in a paper for an audience like this one, where everybody's going to be really excited about those details and want to know more. And I think the third thing that shouldn't be in a policy brief is a lot of waffling, and this kind of goes to Carrie's point on what might it mean. Like, don't say, well, we don't really know anything based on this. That was not a useful policy brief to read. Be okay with taking a stand, as certain as you feel. This is probably my biggest point when I talk to academic audiences. Like, I know we are, as academics, when I was an academic, taught to couch our thinking. Policymakers want to know, do you have anything to tell me that I might be able to use to make a decision? And if you don't get in the space with your really excellent research, someone with a lot less good research will. So be assertive, be okay with saying, based on this, a promising practice. We were in a session yesterday talking about, you can use the term promising practice versus evidence-based work, or you downgrade that part if you want, but say something. don't just hedge and hedge. So no hedging, no technical jargon, not too many words.
Great. Matt, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just have one kind of more general comment across a couple of these questions. I do, and I think at Urban in general, we think of these things as a continuum. It's not like there's two things. One's the long thing, one's the short thing. We think of a continuum where on one end of the continuum is the 100-page PDF with technical appendices and regression tables, and on the other end is like a tweet. And there's sort of a continuum. So we have things we call research briefs, which you're right sometimes aren't so brief, and maybe they should be research reports. I think it's important for anything that's long to have something short at the beginning of it, because even if I'm picking up a 20-page report, sometimes I don't want to read it, but most of the times I want to, at least I want the one-page summary to know whether I want to read more. And it's also important that the longer thing always exists somewhere, right? Like, I agree with the point that you don't need to get into how you got there, but somewhere someone should be able to find out how you got there. Because if someone calls me up and says, hey, I got this one pager from so-and-so and it says blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, that sounds a little strange. Send me a link to the longer one. If the longer one doesn't exist, I'm going to say, well, if it doesn't exist, maybe, maybe we shouldn't believe that. And where you are in that continuum, I think, depends on your audience. I think there are some, policy staff folks who on some topics would want a 10 or 20-page version. When we go over to Capitol Hill to talk about some of our policy areas there, we come with one-pagers, and they are, one page long. So I think it's important to think about kind of that continuum, where on that continuum is sort of the right product for a particular audience you're trying to target.
Yeah, all I was going to say is I think that issue of audience is really important. We've all kind of talked around it a little bit, but sometimes you're writing a policy brief that's going to be broadcasted, you want your uncle to be able to read, right? But sometimes you're not, because sometimes particular organizations are trying to speak to particular audiences. So I'm the faculty director of the Tennessee Education Research Alliance. We're usually writing for people like VENESSA, actually, or CARRIE, within the Tennessee Department of Education, or for stakeholder groups that are really connected to Tennessee education policy. Those people, they don't want to see the technical details. They're not going to be regression equations in a technical brief, or in a brief. That'll be in the technical appendix, but they do want to know why we were able to draw the conclusions we were drawing, and we need to be able to explain that in language that's understandable, intuitive, and doesn't require showing an equation. But we are targeting that. We're doing that specifically because we're doing it with a particular audience in mind, and so who your audience is can really matter for how things are framed and what the specifics of how you approach the brief are.
I'd love to elaborate just a little bit on one thing Vanessa said about the regression tables. So here at AEFP, it's very common and probably good practice to show the progression of first you do the raw thing with no controls, and then you add in your demographic controls, then you add your fixed effects, and blah, blah, blah. Policymakers trust you to be the expert on your topic and to tell them this is the right way to model this statistically, and they don't want to know how all of that, again, it should be a technical appendix, should be available, but it's much, much better to just settle on one that you think is right with your feedback of your colleagues here and use that as your finding that you're summarizing from instead of building up to it, unless there's something truly crucial in the difference that people need to know.
So I think we can kind of bounce off of this idea you're all talking about and talk about how is policy brief writing different than traditional academic writing that we're all sort of trained to do in our PhD programs. Jason, do you want to start with that?
I can start, but I think most of what I'm going to say is going to sound very sad because it's such an indictment of academic writing. But I teach this, and I teach MPP students, and we talk about how to write for policy audiences, and we talk about the importance of clarity, right? The importance of being concise. Strong verbs, short sentences, no jargon, short paragraphs. And that's not about sort of dumbing it down for the audience. It's about making it readable. It's about making it easy to get through. I always tell my students that when you're writing for a policy brief, the goal is for someone to be able to get through it quickly. And because people are busy and they don't have time to spend, you want them to spend time with it, but they shouldn't be spending the time trying to parse what it is that you're trying to communicate. So, clear is really important. Concise is really important. Organized to get to the results quickly, and then backfill the details that help you get there. But it's really about a lot of academic writing is about showing just how much the author knows, and that's really not the point here. The point in a brief that you're writing for a policymaker is what are they going to know and understand at the end of reading the thing that you've produced. And that's just a really different stance from the way that we're trained to write academically, where it's just oh, here, let me give you 9 pages of the literature of what we know about this topic before I get into the analysis. And this is really flipping that on its head. It's almost inverting it. Most of those details are just not relevant, or the person who's reading it already knows that stuff, or knows the relevant parts.
I think one thing for academics that can be a little hard is accepting some loss of precision. Because I mean, there's jargon that's jargon for the sake of jargon, which is always bad and shouldn't be in academic writing. But I think there's some jargon that's important because it's precise. Like in economics, this word means a particular thing, right? A lot of us in higher ed like to get excited about price versus cost, and those meaning different things. And I'm 100% on board for academic writing. But to someone out in the world, it doesn't matter. So I think we need to be willing to accept a little bit of a loss of precision that might make us uncomfortable as the academic writer in order to communicate effectively to a broader audience.
Yes, you lose precision to an academic audience, but you gain clarity, you gain engagement. And it's really useful if you have the opportunity to work with a really good editor who may not know your subject matter that well, and then you can get trained writing this way. Not everybody can employ a ghostwriter, right? But you could find somebody who's not in your field, whose writing you trust, to take a good look. And I know I've always found it so interesting, because I would write a sentence that made perfect sense to me, and then the editor would say, what? What is this? And then I could see with new eyes, because you want to be able to see through the eyes of your audience, of the policymaker you're trying to reach. And that's, it's hard to step into that other person's shoes, but that's what you're aiming for.
There's a fantastic book called Economical Writing by Deirdre McCloskey that I would highly recommend to anybody who's interested in how to write effectively. And there's a great quote that summarizes Jason and Daphne's point. She says, "One must decide to be understood and worry some other time about being admired," which I think is just the best advice you could get for writing. One other point I want to make about how policy briefs are different from academic is that they are not lit reviews, right? Lit reviews are about figuring out, for an academic audience, they're about figuring out what is the unanswered question that my piece is going to fit into, and that's actually the exact opposite of what you want to do in a policy brief. In a policy brief, you want to be finding what do we already know, and maybe what's not known is also useful, but you're not trying to find the hole so that you can fill the hole. You're trying to show the ground around the hole, and maybe the size of the hole. Another thing that I think is common in academic writing is that academics are anticipating a lot of yeah buts from their colleagues. So they're anticipating people saying you didn't cluster your standard errors correctly, or you didn't account for this. So all those things that go into internal validity, and policymakers are much more interested in external validity. So again, they trust you to get the internal validity right, and what they want to know is how does this fit in my context? That sort of information is much more important than the technical details.
You just kind of started this. Does anyone else want to talk about, I was going to ask, what's the difference between a lit review and a policy brief? No one else wants to add anything?
I think Carrie covered most of it. The one thing I would add, and I saw it done well in a commission report the other day, so that's probably different than a policy brief. But if your audience, if you want to kind of hit the high points of the research that contributes to your study, a table is a nice way to do it. Like, this person said this, pros, cons, something that someone can skim down, put the references somewhere. So that's always a great way to organize information, especially, it's period, in the world. But in a policy brief, it's a good way to handle a lit review, not the longer discourse of so-and-so said this, but so-and-so said this, but then there's this. No, here's the body of evidence that sits behind this, or the body of evidence that a policymaker may want to dive into if they were going to form a commission, if they were going to dig deeper, if they were going to call another researcher. So that's I think if you, it's not always appropriate for every policy brief, but if you are there, if you can get it into fewer words in a table, that's really helpful.
I'll just add that I think policy brief type review of the evidence is most helpful when you're willing to both engage deeply with a whole lot of research, but then kind of make a point and take a stand on here's what it says, right? So when Carrie described a lit review, you described a good lit review, which is in an academic paper, which you explain sort of the hole you're filling. A bad lit review is just sort of, I read abstracts of 10 papers that are on my subject, and here's kind of summary what they said. Well, a bad review of the research would just be like, well, there's all these studies and they say all these different things, and you have your 15-handed economist, and who kind of knows what it all means. Well, this study says this and this study says that. I think a good version of it says, well, of course there's uncertainty in the world, but the best available evidence says, you know, kind of here's what it says and here's what policymakers should take from it. And if you're willing to be clear, even if you're, you know, maybe having a little bit less nuance than you prefer, I think it can be more helpful.
This is a question first to the academics in the panel, and then I want to turn it to the policy people on the panel. So, and this kind of hits, Matt, your point that you first made. What audiences are you trying to reach with your policy briefs? And then how does what you're writing and the way you write it differ based on the audience you're trying to reach? You want to start, Daphne?
Our director of communications at PUBS says, give the academic the book or the full report. Send the policymaker the policy brief. But I have to say, I do like reading policy briefs myself as a quick introduction to something, particularly if they're well written. But you know, what we try to do is find the exact policymaker who should read a particular one, and we do some searching and thinking about it.
Sure. I mean, I think in general it's good to have a sense of kind of who your audience is. Sometimes I think we're less clear on that than we'd like to be, and sometimes we think of our audience as being a couple of different audiences, and obviously there's always some sacrifice, trade-off we have to make if we want to write something for a broader audience. It's going to be less narrowly targeted. I think one thing that we could all do more of, I think Congress should do more of, is to be more clear about what we mean by policymaker. It's just this sort of vague term that we throw around a lot, and right, in some sense, Carrie is a policymaker. In some sense, you're not a policymaker, right? I mean, you're more of a policymaker than a professor at a college is, but you're less of a policymaker than your commissioner, right? You know, in federal policy, yeah, the true policymakers are the members of Congress and the senators, but in general, they're almost never the audience for anything we would write, right? It's their staff. Obviously, if we're thinking about state policy or local policy, those would be different audiences. So I think sometimes we're not as maybe targeted as we should be in thinking about that. And maybe part of that is that we have a hard time getting inside the head of all these different people whose jobs we probably haven't done. So we end up just sort of saying, oh, well, let's just sort of say what's useful for policy in some sense.
Would you write differently, though, for a state audience versus a local audience versus a congressperson's staff?
I think I'd write differently only in the sense that I'd be informing a different set of policy decisions, right? So if I'm writing about federal student aid, and I'm writing for congressional staff, I'd be saying, kind of, here's what Congress should think about or should do in the next Reauthorization of Higher Education Act. If I was writing for a state higher education commission, I'd say, well, here's how you should think about something that's related to student aid or has to do with how the state grant programs interact with the federal programs. I wouldn't be talking about income-based repayment of student loans. So I think on the content, you need to kind of push yourself to think about what are the policy decisions they're facing, and what evidence do you have that could inform those policy decisions. But I don't think the sort of the writing or the style would necessarily be that different.
Jason, you want to take a stab?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say something slightly different. Our context is a little different because at Terra, we are writing for a specific audience. And so, or at least a relatively specific audience. We're at least within a defined policy community, and we know we're mostly trying to, we're working with people at the Tennessee Department of Education, so we know who those people are. And so what that actually leads is not so much differences in the content, but I think differences in the process, because they will actually see, some people at Tennessee Department of Education will see multiple drafts of a brief before we ever release it. And a lot of that is about them helping us to ensure that we're saying things in the right way, and that also that we're telling them things that they, that there are constituencies at the department that need to hear. So, I mean, the fact that working context, I think, affects our process more than it affects the way we're pitching. The specific content, it affects more the way we're pitching the content.
So, Vanessa, can you talk a little bit about the different audiences within the State Department? So, it's a complicated organizational structure. How would you suggest researchers trying to make sure that we attract and can actually impact the right people within the department and how?
This kind of goes back to the question about the different types of maybe products that you make as a researcher. And I think about them as layers, like maybe a triangle. So a one-pager, a policy brief slash executive summary is my next one. So one page, and then the next one's policy brief, executive summary, and then the full report or paper, and then a technical appendix. I always think about it in those 4 layers. And I say that because I think they match the audiences at a State Department. So the state chief or the commissioner or the deputy is probably going to want the one-pager. They may glance at the longer executive summary, but they really kind of want the summary. And they also want to have something they can take down the street to the legislature when they go, or to the variety of stakeholder meetings that we attend all the time when we're trying to actually be a state that makes decisions based on evidence. We need the evidence right here in a little digestible bite that we can hand out easily, kind of like a pamphlet almost. And then within a State Department, there are the more technical or the content experts. So my Office of Educator Excellence, for example, would read the full paper that Catherine will produce on teacher mobility and things like that in Michigan. They'll read all of it because they want to know what's happening in it. But I probably won't read. I'll read the summary, and my commissioner would read whatever I give her, but I would probably give her the one-pager. And then there'd be somebody in the department, the more data-focused staff, who would want to look at the technical appendix. They're going to want to know, how did you actually code up teachers, and did you find out that they were teachers? So there's just layers of kind of, it goes from within a state, there's the executive decision makers to the content experts, and then the people who make it all happen, who run the data. And like I said, there's audiences outside the State Department, legislators, stakeholders, lobbyists, heads of associations. They drive a lot of policy in states, so being able to communicate easily to them about, this is what we know about principles, or this is what we know about fill in the blank thing that they're looking at. Those are just those are probably the big audiences for me.
Helpful. Carrie, do you want to add to that?
I agree with everything Vanessa said, and the one audience you didn't mention is the State Board of Ed, which is that's an interesting one because they are our boss, essentially, and they need to make decisions at a level of granularity that's a little deeper than certainly the one-pager, but they don't all have the technical expertise to read the full report. So you just have to be careful with that audience to make sure they have enough information that they're making a good decision, but not bogging them down because they've got 15 decisions every meeting that they have to make.
And that's great. And they're an excellent example of an audience where you better have the full report sitting behind it somewhere. They might only scan the one-pager, but if they turn and say, well, where's the rest to back it up, you need to be able to kind of quickly open up the suitcase and be like, here you go, here you go, here you go, at least my board, or else they'll be like, this is all junk science and we don't want to hear it anymore.
Yeah, and with that audience, I find also that it's better to start at the high level and then let their curiosity take them to what they're interested in, and that's where that backup thing, but you don't do the full-on onslaught of everything to start with. You answer their questions.
So we want to get our policy briefs and our writing into the hands of policymakers. How do we do that? Like, what's the best way to do that?
So when policy briefs are done at the Lincoln Institute, that's only half the work. The other half is getting it to people. And we're lucky that we have a department whose job that is. But one of the key things that they do is get an email list of who they think the right policymakers are. And we have a recent policy brief where there was a debate, should we send it to state legislators? Should we send it to municipal officials? Which makes sense? And so forth. But then we also distribute things in many forms. So on our website, in a blog, in the print, in a magazine. One of the examples I left at the back of the room, there's now a podcast on it. Now, for most people, they can't do all those forms, but most of you, AEFP uses Twitter. So one of my colleagues on his report, when it was released in his signature block, he has a link to where the report is online. So every single person he emails in the day gets some advertisement about his report. But our communications person completely emphasized, you can't just wait for the policymaker to see that you've written something. You must proactively go out to that person. And her suggestion was, if you're in a university, they have government relations people or public affairs people. Those people could help you try to expand the distribution.
Catherine gave me the nod, like, yes, talk, and then I got confused. To add to what Daphne said, I do think that putting things on Twitter, on social media, definitely is helping. I mean, everybody's watching it. If you have anybody's Twitter handle or whatever, somebody who you think, so this is the second part. There's one, putting it in a place where people can get it easily, and there's two, knowing who might care and prompting them in some way. So that requires relationships. So if you don't have enough time to develop relationships, or you don't have the right access with your State Department, try to find at least one friend within the State Department. Try to find someone who's a connector, who knows who to call or who knows who to forward it to. State departments have communications offices, government relations people, so if you don't know anybody, you know, kind of those would be a place to start. But the other thing I would suggest is your institution's research practice partnership. Hopefully most of your institutions have one. So at Michigan State, it's EPIC. There's a lot of you in here are involved with research practice partnerships at different institutions. So if you're not in one, go find the research practice partnership, because they know people at the state, and say, hey, tell me who to start to talk to, maybe, or who's the right person over there. So there's always, and I just heard this talk the other day about Gen Z and how they want the personal referral, and it made me think about, we all still, I mean, we're not Gen Z, some of you might be, I'm not, but we all still like the personal referral. Like, the personal referral never goes away, so if someone sends me something and says, this is really good, you should read this, or like send this on, I'm much more likely to care than those big things that come out from institutes saying, here's the 12 research briefs you should read. You know, that stuff I don't pay as much attention to. But if someone I know and trust says, look at this, then I do. So make relationships, have it in those easily digestible forms, and make sure it's someplace where they can get to it easily. Online, Twitter, like, they shouldn't have to go dig.
So how I've thought about this is, I think, has changed a bit over the years. I think I used to think of the communications function as, you put the report out, the job of the communications person is to make sure it gets sent to all the right people. And that's still true, right? When you put the report out, you do want to tweet it out and send it to the right people and do all the things that you all talked about. But most times we put things out just because we finish them and they're ready to go, right? And I mean, of course, if you can time it to be at exactly the right time, like, great. Once in a while, or sometimes we just get really lucky, and that's great. But most of the time, you're going to put out your policy brief, and no one's going to give a crap about your policy brief, because on that day they have other things to worry about, and your policy brief is not one of them. But a couple of weeks or a couple of months later, they have to make a decision, and your policy brief is exactly what they need that day, and they're not going to remember the email they got from 3 months ago. So I've come to think about sort of the communications operation and sort of the staff people you have around that, if you have them. You should if you can afford it, as being more about these sort of long-term relationship building, both for the communication staff and for the sort of principals, for the researchers, to build those relationships. So the policy folks think to pick up the phone and call you when they have a question, so you can point them to the policy brief, and that there's someone who's kind of keeping a pulse on what's happening. So when they know, okay, today the president signed an executive order saying we're going to publish program level graduation rates, now is the time to reach out to everyone who's going to care about this executive order and say, hey, you need to go look at this policy brief we wrote on program level graduation rates, or earnings, or student loan repayment rates. And yeah, maybe it came out a year ago or 6 months ago, but today's the day you want to look at it. And the last thing I would add is SEO. I think it stands for search engine optimization. Like, being able to find something matters a lot. I think one of my most viewed things of all time is this thing, the first thing I read at Brookings years ago, called Class Size, What the Research Says and What It Means for State Policy. I later did a much better version for JPAM, which with much more nuance. I think it's much more accurate, that no one ever cites. But the quick and dirty version I did, like, I think it's one of the top hits if you search for class size research. People find that, and then they find me, and then I can give them a little bit maybe more context and nuance than was in the quick and dirty version of those years ago.
Yeah, at Terra, we think a lot about how to get attention for the work that we're doing, and Jessica Holter, who's sitting right there, spends a lot of time thinking about how we make that happen. And we have, I think what we're saying is have a strategy. It won't be a perfect one, but we write the brief, and then we're also trying to do a couple of presentations that are in conjunction with that brief. We're going to blast out on Twitter, and it's going to be set up to come out multiple times over multiple days. And in case you missed it, here it is again next week, and that sort of stuff. we push, but the relationships piece is really important. So Erin O'Hara, I think back there, I can't see her. Oh, she's back there. Is our executive director, and she spends a lot of time thinking about the relationships that we have with various constituencies in the state. And we have an advisory council, and who on the advisory council can push this, that would make sense to push this out to their specific constituencies. And then we have the podcast. So we have a podcast that's about Tennessee policy and the sort of the intersection between Tennessee policy and research that Erin co-hosts with Laura Booker from the Tennessee Department of Ed, and it comes out about once a month or so. It's always about a topic, but often that topic is pegged to a brief that we have coming out. And so the point is, we put a lot of time into thinking about how to get things attention, because people are very busy and they're being inundated by email lists every day that are trying to get them to read 35 things. And so how do you get your thing to be top of mind? But you can't just write it and you think it's going to land there, because we're all getting so much stuff all the time, and the personal relationships can be really important, but if you don't have that, you work these other kinds of angles to get it to be top of mind.
I agree with everything that everyone has said, and I will just put a shameless plug in for my presidential address tomorrow, which I'm talking about maximizing research use in the world we actually live in. And I talk about how relationships, organizational structures, and opportunities to interpret research with others really matter. But more on that tomorrow.
Well, one more thing, which is when you're doing the communications part of it, once again, you want to think a lot about audience. I think we all have an inclination to be like, I worked hard on this report. I want to see it in the New York Times. I want to see people loving it on Twitter. I want to see it get lots of clicks. I think it's a natural inclination, but not everything we write, deserves that attention. It's not going to get it. So instead of feeling bad about that, I think it's worth thinking, really concretely about whose mind am I trying to change with this product. And in some cases, it might be like 3 committee staff in your state legislature on Capitol Hill. So it doesn't matter if no one clicks on it. No, it doesn't matter if nobody reads it, as long as those 3 people read it. So I think it's important to think about audience.
So as I'm hearing you talk, and I'm learning a lot, which is awesome. As I'm hearing you guys all talk, I'm thinking about the junior faculty in the audience who don't have centers and don't have communication staff and don't have the processes that you guys are all talking about. What would you suggest for people who are not as well resourced as the people on this panel? For how do they get this all done? Jason, how did you do it before you became you?
I think Vanessa's advice was really good. When I first started, I didn't know anybody, right? I didn't have anybody to send my policy brief to, but you work at that, right? You form relationships over time in partnerships with, in my case, it's been school districts, and then different state departments that I've worked with, and it happens gradually over time. And you're investing in the relationships and the work on the front end, and then this part comes in a sense. I think maybe it's the wrong way to think about it is, I'm going to be writing this policy brief, so let me go figure out where my relationships are going to be, right? You're part of the work over time is in doing the work that's going to be useful, right? You're forming relationships with the people who are going to be able to use it, hopefully. That's not very, that's not great advice in the sense of like, that's not telling you what to go back and do, tomorrow to get your policy brief attention, but I think it is just sort of a fact.
So I would add that if you are, it's expanding on Jason's point. You are in some way interacting with other human beings to do your research, because you either are, maybe you're going to a state agency and requesting data, so then you know the data person that helped you get your data. Or if you're doing a qualitative thing, you've gone and talked to a bunch of superintendents, so then you can talk with those superintendents when you're done. And it just, you have to start small and build up. One thing I would advise if you're doing quantitative work is that don't just talk to the data person. So I actually, because I'm the research director and I can make people do things, I tell them when I have a new partner, like they must come meet with our policy staff to actually talk about the program that they're interested in studying. But there's no reason a researcher couldn't do the same thing. Start to, who is it that runs this program in the agency, and try to arrange a meeting or a quick conference with something to start to build a relationship that you could then, maybe you then become the person and they say something, and then a month later you see the policy brief from the Lincoln Institute. You say, hey, so-and-so, thought you might be interested in this cool thing Daphne just put out on school finance. It doesn't have to be an internal broker that does that. You can build those relationships yourselves.
Can I just add one quick thing on that? I think that's really great, because also you just learn a ton about how to do the work better by talking to the people that are doing the work. So I don't want to kind of undersell that point. It's not just instrumental, right? I love talking to policy people about the work we're doing, because they always have great insights, right? They understand the context way better than I do looking at the numbers, and so it also benefits the work, which is a boon.
I would add that that institutions like mine, we often are happy to hear from people who want to work with us, and this may be less true of urban than of other places, but a lot of think tanks, yeah, we have resources, but we also like free labor and free content, and some of us run blogs and have to fill them with things. And if you read them, you'll see that those things aren't always the greatest, so you probably could do better than the worst things a lot of us are publishing. So I think there's opportunities to take advantage of the communications infrastructure at some of these places by reaching out to us, and so folks should, maybe not quite everybody in the room, but 10 of you want to send me an email. And spread.
Do we have to fight over that to get who are the 10 from the room?
It'll be a lottery.
A lottery.
Right?
Okay, so
But I think myself and folks like me, you should pitch things to us, and we'll often say, oh, well, maybe that's not a fit for urban, but you should call so and so over at this place because they're really interested in that topic, and I bet they'd love to run something on it.
I think that the points Matt made earlier about this, so you're a junior faculty, your points about make a plan and think about who you want to talk to, literally just make a plan, figuring out how to communicate, who do you think will care about this, who ideally would you talk to, and then the other thing, this all sounds really simple, but make the product. So there's a million examples of policy briefs online, there's probably a template online somewhere, obviously it's better if they can, the shinier and flashier they can be, the better, but a simple, well-done piece of information that I received that somebody said, I know you're working on, I know the Read by Grade 3 bill is up in the Senate right now, and I work on 3rd grade literacy, and here's something you might need to know. The fact that it didn't come out of the shiny, fancy communications machine of something wouldn't matter as much as it was here, and it was for me. So make a plan, work your plan, and have the product, I think.
And I think for junior faculty who want to get tenure, one of the things that has to happen is you have to become known for work in a certain area. So I kind of envision having an academic paper published or some working papers, and then thinking about a policy brief, and then that could be a way for other academics too to know, oh, you're working in this particular area. Let me read some more details. Let me find out more.
So in my experience, people working at the State Department or in districts, central offices are very, very busy and aren't prone to answering emails on a quick basis, or picking up the phone in their office even. So what's the best way to actually do this work, Vanessa? Like you're talking about make the plan and get into the person. How do I do that?
Don't call me, especially not in my office. That will never work. I tell everybody that actually. I should just rip the phone out so that nobody actually gets any false ideas. I think that's a good point. I think what's hard when I'm just gonna speak for myself, what's hard for me when I get a long email that's got a lot of things I have to wade through with 12 asks and 6 backstories and 3 problems, I'm like, I'll get to this later, and later doesn't really come. So most agencies, at least in Michigan, we have a commitment to try to keep up with our email and give answers to constituents within 24 to 48 hours. So make it an email I can actually answer, like, here's my point, here's the thing, something more, or that I can forward on just to again, just make it digestible. I would imagine it's the same for district staff. Like if it's clear who I am, what I want, what I have to offer, and I can read it quickly, then it's more likely to be reacted to versus get in I'll have to deal with this later to figure out what they're actually asking.
So the communication should be even briefer than the policy brief.
Yes.
Well, one underused opportunity is that all of the people we're trying to reach have their own professional associations, right? So there's the Massachusetts Association of State Superintendents, there's school, principals, the guidance counselors, and they run conferences every year, and they need content for the conferences. They have newsletters, things like that. I really think there's an opportunity there for researchers to help fill those niches of that type of content for people. I've tried it a little bit with our superintendents. We had a recent thing come out on school choice, and there's they have regional chairs, and then there's an executive committee or something. So it's maybe 15 or 20 influential superintendents in the state. And I just said, can I have a half an hour on your next meeting? And they know me, right? So that's easier for me than it would be for you. But that kind of thing exists in states. And I think I can imagine a university setting up a partnership with the local association. We will feed you content for your newsletter or something along those lines.
Because CARRIE didn't do it, I'm going to plug CARRIE. So there's also some places that have research directors.
Oh, true.
more and more, I feel like, and a lot of them belong to AFP and have our members here, so
Yep.
you probably didn't think of you call them the unicorns.
Yep.
Right, but they're all wearing pins like this, probably. But so there are people at the states and in districts who actually their job is to help policymakers get research in their hands, to find that person, if that person exists in the place you're trying to go to, like find the CARRIE or the Dare the Humidor who's in Maryland, there's lots of people like that around.
I have one thing.
Yeah.
So the other advice I would add, and this is maybe a little bit just a variation of what Carrie said, which is be useful. And beyond just like what you're writing, like show a willingness to do other stuff like that the policy person wants. So not only are you want them to respond to your emails, well, you want them to feel free to send you emails, and then you should respond to them and be useful, right? So yeah, you send someone a policy brief, and if they write back with some questions or an ask, don't just say, oh, that all sounds very nice, but I'm writing another policy brief now. Like, answer them. Do more work. Do work that's not going to get you anything except that you're going to help that person.
Be helpful. Okay, I've got 2 more questions and we're going to open it up. So the first question I have is, it's already kind of been touched on, but I want to make sure that people think about this. What is the role of the design and the visual components of the policy brief, and how do we need to think about that differently than, and I know this personally, than as an academic where I put my graph up that only people who understand error bars can understand? Like, how do we think about visualizations differently for policy briefs and policymaker audiences?
We want to educate and engage. So engagement is the thing that I would underline. And I think at least economists, when I was trained, are not trained very well in terms of graphs and charts to choose the right colors. Believe it or not, when we publish things, we agonize over, can a colorblind person tell the difference between these colors? Are the axes labeled? Is there enough information, not too much? Is it possible for you to get a photo that would attract attention? And there's just an enormous amount of work spent on all of that. So you want to communicate, but you want somebody to look at it and, whoa, they just feel like they want to pick it up. And I think, titles can make a big difference too. And I've sort of lost track of the search engine optimization, that whole thing. But, I just know that some of the things I've written afterwards, I thought, oh, why did I use that title? It's never cited. Whereas another thing, I agonized over it, and it's just the right title, and then it pops up all the time.
No cute titles.
Right.
You'll spend forever thinking about cute titles. Throw out the title and use after the colon, that's your title.
I think, so design, graphics, layout. Number 1, probably get a logo. I was going to say very assertively, definitely get a logo, and I'm like, maybe everybody doesn't need a logo, but in a lot of situations, you probably want a logo. If you can't make one, you've got to have a graphic design friend somewhere who has aspirations to make you one, or go find the comms department at your university and find an undergrad and give them $50 or something to make you a logo. And then come with a look and feel. So this is about policy briefs. The purpose of the logo is for them to know who made it visually so they can see it. And then a look and feel of the policy brief, stick with it, clean, concise, attractive, colors matter, looking up some of the standards for the accessibility and the color blindness, that would be good. And then as much as it's like a graphic to summarize, not even a graph of your chart, but a graphic to summarize your big idea. If you can put the idea into a picture, I mean, this is like the oldest saying in the world, right? A picture is worth 1,000 words, but it's really accurate. And I have found personally, and I will say the Department of Education in Michigan is not wildly successful at its branding and communication, so I'm talking to myself as much as you guys in many ways. But when we've been successful in our messaging, it's when we've come up with a picture, and it's got our logo on it, and it's got bullets, and it's on a standard sheet, and somebody's like, oh yeah, I remember the picture, I remember that thing. So put your idea, your theory of action, or your big finding into a picture, and then don't have cute titles, but have concise turns of phrase that stick, catchphrases. So like, one we're using a lot with something right now, we need to put our processes in alignment with our promises. We're promising a whole child education focus, so we need to put our processes in alignment with our promises. Because it's got alliteration and it's catchy, and people might remember it when they're like, what was she blathering about the rest of the time? Oh, processes, promises, and there was a picture. So those are I think the look and feel of policy briefs and the content having that distillation that someone can walk away with is really important.
Matt, can you say something, because I feel like Urban does a very good job with interactive visuals. Can you talk about a little bit about how you guys think about that?
Yeah, so hire a team of people who can code in D3. I mean, I'm sort of joking, but I mean, yeah, we're lucky that we have a team of people who can build these really nice interactives. I probably shouldn't give away like competitive secrets about how you can all compete with us and do it better. But there's actually contractors who do it pretty well too. Our visualizations, we have like a really strong set of a style guide and the colors, and it's all supposed to have a uniform look. So you can't tell this when you go to our website, but not everything is made in-house. Sometimes the in-house people are busy and we subcontract things out. And sometimes we even subcontract the designers, but they're all working from the same style guide, which is why it has the uniform look. So the point is, even if it doesn't make sense for your organization to hire a team of 3 or 4 full-time people who are building these interactives, and we have that because we just have lots of people, there's lots of demand for the work. There are firms out there, and I'm happy to offline recommend individual ones we've worked with, that will build those things for you. And I mean, they're not cheap, you'll need grant money or something to pay for it, but much cheaper than kind of having your own people. So that's something we do, the interactives are something we do a lot of, which I think can be a pretty effective way. I mean, I agree with, I think Jason said earlier, having the visual, like the killer chart on the static one-pager can be really, really powerful. And then I think that, the kinds of tools we can build that are more interactive can also be a good way to sort of, highlight issues and educate people and walk them through something that would be more challenging to show in a static way. And can also be a powerful way to provide data to people. So a lot of the work that we do, sometimes it'll result in we're generating a whole bunch of information which we want to make available. Right? In the old days, you'd post an Excel file online somewhere and whatever, download it. So we often then work with the data viz people to build a front end that enables the user to kind of interface with the data. So for example, we recently did some work on Pell Grant simplification, and we ran models of 35,000 different versions of the Pell Grant program, right? So it's just different combinations of really just 3 different parameters of maximum grant and how you do the income phase out. So we have our 35,000 sets of results of distributional consequences for students and an estimate of what the CBO would tell Hill staff it would cost. We could have posted the 16 megabyte Excel file online, and we actually did post it. You can go download it. But then we built a front end, which is the interface for someone to visualize and see, okay, as I change these different parameters of the Pell Grant program, and it affects the distribution to students of different income groups and different racial and ethnic backgrounds and different sectors of higher education, and then as it affects the federal budget, I can just see those things moving visually. And obviously that's a much more compelling way to interact with those 35,000 versions of the Pell Grant program than a data file.
I have so many thoughts on this. So the visualizations are super important, and if I could wish each of you a superpower, it would be to be really good at coming up with awesome data visualizations. I wish I had that superpower myself. I am not terrific at it, but I've gotten better. It is something you can get better at. One resource I find really helpful is Stephen Few. It's a PH Stephen. He has a bunch of stuff online, Perceptual Edge. Just like, he has a simple one-page thing of like, which graph goes with the kind of data that I have? Should I do a line chart or a bar chart or whatever? There's simple things like that you can level up quite a bit, and it will make a big difference on how your work is perceived and used. 2 things I hate. If you work for me, do not give me a pie chart, ever, or a y-axis, where the y-axis is the difference between 2 things. Please show me the 2 things as 2 levels so I can compare the level. Having it all relative to 0 just hurts my head. It just makes me bananas. Now, if other people might not mind those, but I really, really hate those. One last point I would make is that the way you choose to visualize your point can really affect how people interpret the finding. And let me give you a concrete example. I have to put this down because I have to have a hand free. So Dan Goldhaber and his research team did a bunch of research with us recently on educator preparation programs in the state, and one of the things we did was to measure for each one essentially their value added as a point estimate with a 95% confidence interval. So for each one of our programs, we have a point and a confidence interval. the first way we displayed it is we sorted them low to high on the point estimate. So you get this kind of like, we call it the caterpillar graph. And what that immediately points to is who's low and who's high, which might be the right conversation depending on your findings. In this case, that was the wrong conversation, because in this case, almost all of the programs were statistically indistinguishable from one another. And so pointing out the high and low was not really what we wanted people to take away from it. So we ended up sorting them randomly, and then we color-coded the high and low so you could easily tell which ones were above and below, but without it being quite so stark, and it totally generated a different conversation than the original version of it. So be thoughtful about what people are going to take away from what you've said, or what you've drawn.
Can I say one quick thing? Just what I thought Carrie might say about one of the things that she hates, and I say this because Erin says this a lot to the researchers we work with, which is stop presenting things in standard deviation units. Nobody knows what a standard deviation is. And so you have to think creatively then to a person who doesn't have a good intuition for what a standard deviation is. How are you going to express in that data visualization something in a percentile change or percents of something? Or is this about grade level changes in proficiency? Something about units people can understand for that one graphic is really important.
Yep.
I'll add one more thing that builds on something Vanessa said, which is everyone wants to know how their district or their area is doing, right? And so when we talk to policymakers, legislators in Michigan, they want to know how your district is doing. Heat maps are amazing. We have a student, I don't know if she's here, she is Danielle, she's over there, who makes amazing heat maps. And like when I talk to people, like that heat map that showed me this in my district compared to everyone else's district, or the prevalence of something in Michigan here versus on the western side of the state. Those things have gotten us more traction in terms of interest in the research that we're doing than anything else that we do. So I would say if you can do that, that's going to get people to care. Okay, my last question, then I want to open it up. And this is something, Jason, I'm going to give it to you first because you mentioned this on the prep call that we did. What processes do you put in place in order to produce a policy brief?
So for time, I won't go really deep into the process that we use, but and it's changed over time, but we have a pretty, I'll say it this way, we have a process that has a lot of feedback points that are built into it because we found that feedback is really, really important. And so often our policy briefs, sometimes we're writing from a particular research article. And so the way we work at Terra is that MPP students often take the major lead on the writing. So Grace, sitting right here, is one of our students. She writes some of our policy briefs, and so they draft them. And so Grace actually interviews the researcher with a protocol to draw out what the major points are, and what are the things we want to emphasize, and so forth to draft. And then we'll present it to our internal team, and our internal team will give feedback about it. And then the researcher will read it, and there'll be lots of internal feedback. But then we start this external feedback process as well, where we have knowledgeable folks that we work with that we want to read for content, to read for presentation, to make sure that we're hitting the right points. And as a result, a little bit counterintuitively, ends up taking kind of a long time to put one out, even though it seems like the point of a policy brief is to be timely and quick. But even though I think that is the goal, we found that it takes time because it's really important that we get both the internal and external feedback in from several different kinds of stakeholder groups so that we can produce a high quality product that's going to hit the mark with what we're aiming to do with it.
I'll add a little bit on that. Is it Mark Twain who said if I had more time it would be shorter? If not, if somebody said that, that's exactly it. Like for a policy brief, and I think you said this before, Daphne, you should really probably anticipate that half your time is going to be on the writing piece of it and not the analytical side. Whereas I think an academic piece should be much more heavy on the analysis and relatively less on the writing. So the more clear, straightforward, non-technical it is, the more time it will take you to do.
Well, there is a debate about whether some policy briefs should be quick. Like if there's a policy that's being debated or some law that might just be passed, should you be quick and get a policy brief out? That's not the way that Lincoln is going. It's more in line with what Jason described as a process, that we have a long report and everything is reviewed, and once the report is done, it might take a couple years, then you do a policy brief. But does anyone have experience with the shorter, like quick turnaround policy brief, or is there anyone in the audience that's keen on the quick policy brief?
Tammy?
We do a lot for the Vermont legislature because the agency doesn't have any staff, and so we have a standard format where we provide 5 bullet points back to the Ed Committee within 4 hours.
So, Tammy, no one could hear you, unfortunately, because you're not, so I can just, I'll try to paraphrase. Let me try to paraphrase. She has a 5 bullet point template that she uses when the legislature needs something quickly in Vermont, so that we can respond very quickly, right? And I'll use an example. You know, when I first got to MSU, I got a call from VENESSA that she said, look, we've got this policy, we need, our superintendent needs to be able to defend, you know, talk about it in the media. Can you guys please help us quickly disseminate distill the research so that we can have talking points so that we can show that this is what we're doing. And so we were able to very quickly, I think in the course of a weekend, it was not a polished policy brief, but it's to Matt's point about there's different kinds of things to write and different audiences need different things.
Yeah, we do, you know, some of this. I mean, sometimes it'll be short turnaround in the sense of, you know, back in 2016, you know, Bernie Sanders was talking about free college. You know, I wrote something that was sort of an empirical analysis of the likely distributional consequences of his plan. It wasn't like the day after it came out, but maybe it was, might have even been a few months after it came out, but it was during the kind of campaign. Sometimes you can position yourself to be able to move even faster than that. So I talked about the 35,000, you know, Pell runs we did. Well, that's based on an underlying Pell simulator model we've built off of restricted use NCES data. So that means that the next time the Senate Help Committee has a proposal to change the Pell program, you know, we can run the numbers on that within a matter of an hour. We then have to wait 5 business days for IES to approve the release of the estimates, but it can be quick that way.
Okay, I'd like to open it up to the audience to see if people have questions.
Sorry, close to the mic, so I'll do this.
It's on.
Okay.
It's on.
I just need to get closer. So Jason and Daphne, you described in a little bit way, I'll sort of use you as an example in terms of the relationships that go along with the briefs. So Daphne, you described, for example, but I assume that when we pick up the things at the back of the room that you left, that these are types of things where someone from the Lincoln Institute is there who can talk about it, handing that brief over. And Jason, it looks like a lot of the processing of the briefs are to hand to staff inside the state government who will then, they're going to be the ones passing it off or forwarding it. Can you, is there any sort of like rule of thumb for the rest of us for thinking about what is the difference between structuring a brief when we have that direct relationship with an audience versus creating something that we want someone else to represent and have that relationship?
I'm not entirely sure I understand your question, but let me, give it a crack. Oftentimes it's easiest for the author to be passing out the policy brief because they know the detail of the research. But one of the benefits of working with an editor or a communications person is that that person gets educated, plus educates the author on how to communicate. And so there's a lot of institutional knowledge that's more broad. And so, like, one of the examples at the back of the room is a policy brief on tax increment finance, which is a type of economic development tool. And in the process of helping the author with his report, I learned enough, so yes, I could hand that out, but also the communications people learned it kind of backwards and forwards, and we ended up with a film that had a segment on tax increment finance that was against the conclusions of the author, and they just gasped when the film was shown, and the filmmaker thought, who falls on the floor when they hear about tax increment finance? But it was just so opposite. So I think the ideal is to have a lot of communication so that there's more than one person who really knows the party line and knows the vetted research and the main conclusion.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, I think for us, because of this iterative process we've gone through, there are sort of like champions at the Department of Education who understand that policy brief really well. Not just us, so the people in the research team, the people who are like Carrie, they understand. So we worry less because those are going to be the people, if it's not us, that are going to be passing it around, and they know that content by the end of the process almost as well as we do.
From U.S. Department of Education, IES. I really appreciate what everybody said about visualizations, and it's something that we're challenged, not very good at. We're good at the tables, the graphs, regressions, and so forth. Do you think it's worth our while to try to get trained in visualization? I mean, Carrie said you could pick it up a little bit, or is it better to bring in people that know Tableau, or is it worthwhile for us to try to learn the visualization aspect ourselves?
I would say that it's probably good for everyone working in research hub to at least get to the point that they can produce a decent, clear graph. Tableau is a whole other level. I mean, so for those that don't know, it's essentially a way to make data more interactive and easy to sort of parse and that kind of stuff. And I feel like that takes a different level of skill that maybe not every researcher would want to develop. But if you're fortunate to work in a place that's large enough that you could have those types of people, I have someone on my staff who's really good at that kind of thing. But the thing that she sometimes lacks is the research context. So you need like a bit of both, because you need to make sure the visualizations make sense, and that's what the researcher's job is, and then the data viz person can make them kind of cool once they understand the message that you're trying to send with your data.
Yeah, I was going to say this earlier, so I appreciate the question. I think it's important to recognize what we're not good at and what our institutions might not be good at. And something that the Michigan Department of Education we've had to do is actually hire people with marketing, PR, data visualization. It's hard when you have limited positions. It's hard to say, oh yeah, we'll put one into this. But what we found over time is our policies weren't getting where they needed to go because of the mechanism, the lack of the packaging made the policies stop. And then people were confused, it was a vacuum. So realizing that like our best effort, my best logo design or whatever is not adequate, and that we do actually specialty work, just like we wouldn't try to have somebody run our databases who, kind of one time, I don't know, looked at some Excel spreadsheets or something. Like you hire experts for what you need, and this is an area of expertise. So I think it's acknowledging that some training's good, but there is a level of like, you need an expert for it, and trying to prioritize it as a thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Well, as much as you need an expert, one thing I want to emphasize is you have to have some kind of overlap, some kind of check, because you can have someone who's a fabulous designer and the whole thing looks beautiful, but then they make some tweak or some change which impacts the meaning or makes it difficult for the policymakers that are out there who want to scan the information in a certain way. And so it's like a whole process of overlapping skills where you say, yeah, you're an expert at this, but you've gone too far here. And so you can't just hand over and then look at it sometime later.
Some of us in the audience are interested in publishing our policy briefs. So hitting two birds with one stone. What's your advice?
So I'll take that one first.
Yes.
So first of all, EFP on our website, we have our version of policy brief template. So sort of it's 12 pages max, what we want to see. We don't have definitions about graphics, but again, we're publishing in black and white. Ours are ungated, so the reason we do that at EFP is so that all the policymakers can access it, even if it's not. So I would suggest that if you're going to try to publish a policy brief in EFP, you look at what we say you should do and then do it. The other thing is, policy briefs get published in a lot of other journals and outlets as well, and most of them have examples in the past that so what I've done is I've looked at examples that journal has run and tried to emulate, because that's obviously been, or improve. Jason, you want to add that?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about ER, that I want to put Catherine back on the spot and ask her as an editor what she's looking for when she's looking at policy briefs. But I mean, I'm the editor of Educational Researcher, and we publish a category called Reviews and Essays. They're sort of like policy briefs. They're more like review articles. So they're short, though. They're only 4,000 words. So, but they're not necessarily pitched at a policy audience. They're more about bringing a body of work together. But that's the category that gets the closest. And certainly there could be certain kinds of policy briefs that work really well in that category. It's just not typically what we get. But Catherine, my guess is you get a lot more of the kinds of briefs that policy briefs that people are thinking about in this audience, and I'm curious in the review process, what are the characteristics of ones that are successful?
So we don't. We would like to get a lot more. So this is a new section for EFP. So we've kind of sporadically had them in the past. This is the first time we've actually said we actively want them, and I think part of that's because we are trying really hard as an organization to get policymakers to read the work that you all are producing, and to do that we need them to be in the format they can read. So 12 pages might be too long, but we think that that is the max that people can read. And ours is a little bit more of an academic version, I think, an academic version of a policy brief, because it is going to be published in a peer-reviewed journal, and it's going to go through peer review. We say that the policy brief should have the following components: an introduction that summarizes the problem and the key findings. To the point, the first little bit should tell you, here's why we're addressing this very important problem that policymakers should care about right now, and here's what we're going to tell you. So then only Vanessa reads the one page and she's got it, right? Then we say, okay, now define the problem. So it doesn't help to kind of vaguely say, like, we're talking about college affordability, right? Like, that's a big problem. Like, that's probably too big for a 12-page policy brief. So what is the specific problem you're trying to address with this policy brief? Then we say, if you're gonna, we would like you to say something about the previous literature on it, or if you might not even have new empirical evidence. It might just be a review of the literature and like what we know. But it needs to be objective. So sometimes we've gotten things that I know the literature well, and I'll read it, and I'm like, well, they've left out the half of the things that are the other point. Well, we're not going to let that through peer review, right? You need to have an objective assessment of the literature. If you're going to put in the empirical evidence, we want to see the empirical evidence. It's new, but we don't want the methods. We just don't need all that. So if it's appropriate to add your new empirical evidence, this is what we know from the literature already, and then here's how it applies to Massachusetts in this example. Great. And then we want discussion of policy alternatives in EFP. So we want people to be able to say, well, here's what we think, and like, here are the other things that could have been done that we don't think. And then a recommendation, and then a discussion for why this is appropriate for the policymaker to act on. So that's what we have in our sort of 12-page outline. We would happy to have them be 6 pages or 4 pages, but we know that it's very hard for people like me to write a 6-page paper. We suggest that to make the brief easier for policymakers to just skim quickly, to use headers and subheaders to highlight your key points that are descriptive. So not cute, not like methods. We actually don't want methods, but not findings, that actually like, what's your takeaway? And by the way, I'll say this and my students all will like roll their eyes when they hear me say this, but I say this about any slides you're going to give to policymakers too. Your header should always be your takeaway, because that makes it easy for people to digest. We say you should use tables and figures to make your key points and synthesize information. It's just much easier for me to flip and see the figure than it is for me to try to read through your text. We say limit the use of passive voice. This is the thing that drives me crazy when we're trying to like address policymakers and we act like this happened 16 people ago and 16 years ago, right? And we say avoid complicated sentences with many clauses, right? Avoid excessive use of adverbs. By the way, you can tell this is written by an entire committee of editors because it's very long. So these are the things that we say. And then we have instructions for reviewers. So when I send a policy brief out for review, I give the reviewers a different set of recommendations of how I want them to review. It's not a typical review. And I say, do they make the cases important? Is it an objective review of the literature? Do they have strong evidence? I mean, are they just basing it on like nothing? Is it clear? Does it have organized? Is it organized and concise? Does it have a technical appendix, if appropriate, that we could link to online? So if you're going to bring to bear new empirical evidence, I need it to be somewhere that I can have someone look at it. And then is it useful? That's what we look for. Jason? Anyone else want to talk about what they look like? Matt or Deb?
I just wanted to add, I realized I should put my Education Next hat on quickly, since I'm an executive editor of Education Next, which is a lot of you probably know is a journal of sort of both research and opinion. So we have a peer-reviewed research section, which is a section that I'm responsible for, and there we publish, really good academic articles, but we translate them for a more general audience. So we usually get them down to, I'd say, around 3,000, 3,500 words. Maybe not quite policy brief, because they're really research articles, but that are shortened. And then we have maybe 3 or 4 of key figures showing the findings. So not exactly a policy brief, but still, aimed at reaching a broader audience. So feel free to send in or suggest your work or other work you think might be interested in. Excuse me. But we also have other sections of the journal with future articles that are maybe a little bit more policy brief-like, where a synthesis of the evidence on something could be useful. And we also have a blog, which can be a chance, since there's limited space in the journal. We publish a lot of content on the blog, which is, someone has an interesting new study out and wants to kind of put it to something digestible. It's obviously can be pretty quick turnaround. So I also encourage folks to think of that as a possible outlet for your work.
Ask Jason the hard question.
I do
It's
actually
better
have
on
a
that.
question, but I'm going to say a couple of things first.
Yeah.
Okay. So just a couple of things I was thinking about while
Wait,
y'all
wanna
were
introduce
talking.
yourself?
Oh, I'm Erin O'Hara. I work with Jason in Tennessee.
Get a
I
little
think.
closer to the mic.
Oh, sorry. So one important thing I think to remember, it's like hard, I think, when you're doing academic research and you have this, as you go up the chain in academics, you get sort of more and more specific in some ways on what you're doing. Like maybe you take on other expertise, but it's really important that you have this, as Vanessa was talking about, this very deep expertise in something. And as you go up the chain in the policy world, you have less and less expertise. You have more and more things that you're responsible for. And so when you think about this thing of like dumbing it down, as Jason said, it's not necessarily you're dumbing it down for folks as much as it's just that they might have like 15 things they're responsible for. And though your one thing is so important and you have all the information about it, it's important just to remember that. I think it's sort of implicit, but just wanted to say that. With the conversation about junior faculty, I think one of the things that's also really important is not just that we do it at Terra, is not just to engage afterwards, but actually to engage with the research question. So you can, as a junior faculty member, also do the same thing where you're not just requesting data from an agency, but you're saying, what's important to you, what do you want to know, and that matches with my interest in X and such way. Then my last point for my question is testing out the conversation about graphics and visualizations. One of the things we find really useful is actually to test them with folks. So show it to a policy person or your uncle or whatever to actually get their reaction, because they can tell you whether or not they're going to understand it. And echo your point about the title actually is important. So my question is actually about, you talked, Katharine, about policy alternatives. You all have mentioned briefs having recommendations. We struggle with this. Like, when you get to the conclusion section, how much can you actually say? And then how do you decide what to say based on the research and not wanting to, I think to several of your point, like go too far, but sort of strike the right balance. So I'd love to hear, especially the academic folks, talk about that.
I've asked Vanessa actually talk
Oh
about
yeah,
that first.
well,
because
or
I think
Vanessa, that's fantastic.
I actually was thinking as the conversation progressed that I said don't hedge, and I meant that. I mean don't hedge about what you learned. And to Carrie's point, we trust that you're the experts. We trust that you did a really good job with your research. We also trust that communities like this have eviscerated you if you didn't. So by the time you're writing it up, you know what you know. Like, trust your training, trust your intelligence, and tell us. I do think, though, what I should have also said is don't include political musings, anything that's going to damage your Department of Education in a way that's not fair, wild hypotheses like what we really just need to do is pass a policy of statewide salary schedule and then it would all be easy. Like, please, or if you're going to make big sweeping policy recommendations, and especially if you're in partnership with your state, talk to them about like, how on message is this? How much could you support this? There is nothing worse as a policymaker than some legislature whipping out something and they said, well, so-and-so from such and such says all we need to do is get rid of the state summative assessment and everything would be fine. And it's research, so there you go. And I'm like, yes, it is. So be really bold about what you know. Be really careful about what you don't. And not in the same way that we are in academia, like you know your finding, what did you find? And then if you are going to make like recommendations or policy conclusions or whatever, probably think carefully about who you want to talk to about those. Or if your goal is to somehow provoke or prompt the agency that you're talking about, then go ahead and swing for the fences. But if you want their partnership, talk with them about what to say. And that is not the same as hiding findings. It is different. So it is one thing to say teachers in Michigan need more high quality mentorship opportunities, and it's another to say, and we know that, you know, the problem is inadequate staffing in the Department of Education and a disrespect of teachers, and the solution is to fire everybody at the state or whatever. I mean, these are obviously like fairly extreme examples, but be clear about your findings, but be careful about your generalizations or speculations. Does that help?
It's so difficult to come up with reasonable findings that are evidence-based, that aren't platitudes. And so almost when I work on a policy report, I start thinking about what the findings are at the beginning, and then I talk to people and test things out. Like we've done reports on tax incentives, and when we had this report that came out that was getting to a draft stage, then the communications people said, oh, what you mean is all tax incentives are bad. And we're like, no. You know, they can often be bad, but then kind of had to walk back and say, well, what are we saying about these incentives? And we had to be a little bit more specific, but it was kind of like a dance, if not a battle, or something to go back and forth. And then that's the part of the report that's written again and again and again and again. And you want to make it relevant, not a platitude, it's supported. But sometimes when you get done, you're so much in the weeds that you come up with a conclusion and it makes sense to you, and people are like, you know, they think it means something else. So you got to try it out.
I'm just going to add one specific example that's kind of on what you were saying. There's a report that just got released recently. It's very good, high quality research, and the finding is there's big achievement gaps and they're persistent and they don't seem to be shrinking. Toward the end, the authors kind of did some general discussion about why, what might this mean? In our state, the story that got picked up came from the part where they were like, maybe it's because, like, it wasn't the part of the article, unfortunately. And I think that that was a really good example of what can happen. Like, the big takeaway got lost, at least in the messaging, about maybe it's because, like, teachers need to be better. The article wasn't actually about teachers. There was no evidence cited, no study was done on teachers. It was something totally different. But that's what got picked up and got played. So that's not great.
I'm just going to add one thing here. So one thing that I've learned a lot from the work with LA Unified and with MBE has been that you cannot take the politics out of the policy. And so in any kind of policy recommendation, I really try hard to think, kind of what Vanessa said, is this even a feasibility? Like, what are the constraints on the policymakers that we need to be really aware of before we say, this may be what we think from research is the best, but this the best is never going to happen. And maybe it shouldn't. Maybe there are reasons that we don't know that it shouldn't or it just won't. So what are the things that we can suggest that maybe they look incremental to us and not like big deals, but they actually would be helping us go in the direction we want to go and actually achievable in this context? And you can kind of think about it. That's how I've been trying to think about it and help us think through with our partners is, okay, well, what could you do? Here's what we think the direction is. What could you even do now with that? What would be helpful to you to have us put in there?
One other thing I try and use to discipline my thinking is to imagine that whatever goals the policymaker has, that they decide on the goals, and my job as the analyst is to help them understand how different policies might map into those goals or not into those goals, right? So the statement would be something like, if your goal is to reduce the burden of student loans on low-income, struggling borrowers, reducing interest rates wouldn't get you there, and the research shows that for reasons X, Y, and Z. If your goal is to give a big handout to rich people, reducing interest rates on student loans would help you accomplish that goal, right? So helping, and they can decide what they're, what they're trying to accomplish, right? Same thing if you're doing tax policy. It's not your job as the analyst to say what the marginal tax rate on billionaires should be. It's just to say, well, if we change the marginal tax rates in this way, here's how the distribution would change. So sometimes we stray from that and say, of course we want to improve outcomes for kids. And so it's not that you always have to think of it that way, but I think it can be a helpful way to discipline your thinking and really have your analyst cap on and not have your advocate cap on.
Anyone else? We are keeping you from your happy hour. Okay, well, thank you to this great panel of very